Greetings to you. This is the fourth video that I've done on the flood account and looking at the flood account in a Christ-centered way. And when you do that, it shows that a local flood makes more sense than a global flood. The text is really pointing to a flood that wiped out everything that was created in chapter 2, which is a smaller work, not the larger work created in Genesis chapter 1. It was instead the works designed to bring Messiah and to prepare the world for Messiah, to bring the world to a state of civilization that it could properly receive Messiah. And also Messiah himself, because Adam is the father of Messiah. The New Testament confirms this in Luke. So it's a very different way of looking at it than the rabbis look at it. And the rabbis look at it as a story about the whole world. It's global in extent. It's all life on earth. They don't distinguish between the line of Messiah and other lines. And they don't make it about Christ, obviously. And that's how you know it's wrong. Even though the church held on to it, they just adopted it from the rabbis and has, in some circles, have held on to it. It's wrong because Jesus said in 546, John 5:46, that Moses wrote about him. Moses wrote about him so much so that if you didn't believe in Moses, or if you didn't believe in him rather, you didn't believe in Moses either. That's just how much that Moses was writing about the work and person of Christ, that you can't even separate Jesus out of it. And obviously, the traditional interpretation of the flood account, agreed to by the rabbis who opposed Christ, does not fit that criteria. It's not it's not what Jesus said Moses was writing about. So I'm going to agree with Jesus and not the people who opposed him, and look at the text in a Christ-centered way, even if it's not the way I was taught growing up to believe in it. We have to cast aside interpretations that do not include Christ, because he said Moses wrote about him. And I did that with 3 other videos. And I want to give a brief recap. This video is going to be about after the flood, and God made a couple of statements after the flood that some interpreted to mean, well, it must be a global flood. And that's incorrect. Early Genesis, and the flood account in particular, is very badly translated in just about every version of the Bible I've ever seen. And I don't know that the translators were being sort of intentionally malicious when they would do things like take 2 different Hebrew words and translate them as the same English word, and really not even the best English word to describe what's going on. Or whether they noticed paradoxes in the text, so they tried to paper them over. For example, they noticed that maybe the list of animals that God said to take on the ark was a smaller list, was a more reduced list. It wasn't as inclusive of all the animals. And yet every category of animals is included as getting off of the ark or being loaded onto the ark. And so they tried to paper over those paradoxes. And in my opinion, they should not have, because really those were clues that there was a deeper story there. It was beyond the story that the rabbis were telling. The mystery of Christ that Paul referred to 20 times in the New Testament is at work here too. Here too, he is hidden in the text, waiting to be revealed until the key, Christ, comes, and you can go back and look at the text again and see it differently. And when you look at it as this is all an effort to preserve the line of Messiah, to keep the world from going into ruin, so that the world will eventually be redeemed by Messiah, that civilization will continue, that the line of Messiah will continue until Jesus can come and save the world from going into ruin completely. And if you look at it like that, instead of a global flood physically wiping out everything and taking away physical life, then you begin to see the Christ in it, and then it makes sense. It makes sense even with these quirks in the text that they're trying to paper over. Not only that, it has tremendous apologetics value, because the critics, with all their points about, oh, well, it contradicts what we think we know about nature, it contradicts what we think we know about history, all that goes away just as a byproduct. It's not even the point. We're not even trying to explain those things away. They just disappear when you look at the text as pointing towards the work and person of Christ. And I showed in those earlier videos, I'll recap briefly the 3 earlier videos. You can watch them if you like. And I go into detail there. I will only go into detail about chapter 9 and the statement God makes that some have interpreted to mean there was a global flood in this video. But in the other videos, the first one was about Genesis chapter 6. It supports a global flood, a local flood, when you look at it in a Christ-centered manner. And if you look at the statements that Elohim, and most people pronounce him Yahweh, if you look at the statements they make in chapter 6 and see it through a Christ-centered manner, they really point to a local flood with global consequences. And the global consequences are the whole earth would go to ruin if those chapter 2 works were wiped out in a local flood. That would be the global consequence. Everyone would eventually die. Die is defined as being cut off from God, not being drowned in a flood. And then I did a second video, and it was about how there is nothing in Peter, the writings of Peter, that would rule out a local flood. Some have taken some things in the epistles of Peter to mean that the text demands a global flood. It does not. In fact, it makes great pains to leave room for a local flood, including, and this is a common excuse I hear, well, if the flood was local, why didn't God just have Noah, or why didn't Noah just take his animals and go away somewhere, go away to another land that was not going to be flooded? Why did he stay there and go through the flood? And Peter actually answers this question, because the flood is a foreshadowing of baptism. And obviously, it's a much better foreshadowing of baptism if it's something that Noah submits to voluntarily, passes through the waters of God's judgment in faith that God will deliver in him what should be delivered and blot out the sin that should be blotted out. That is pointing to baptism. That is giving Noah true credit for being a hero in the faith. Let me ask you something. If the flood was global, is Noah a hero of the faith for building the ark? Maybe he's just doing it to save his own skin. The way he becomes a hero in the faith is if the flood is local, he could escape it, but he chooses to go through it because that's what God told him to do. Instead of he's just trying to save his own skin because the flood is global, he's trying to do what God told him, even though he could not be baptized, not pass through the waters of God's judgment, not have to build an ark, not have to go to all that trouble. But it was for our sakes that these things happened. And so that was what I said about Peter. And then I did, in chapter 7, I did a video about why chapter 7 does not demand a local flood, or rather a global flood. And that one is a little trickier because it has to do with the nature of what early Genesis is. And early Genesis, if you believe that the way it came about was that Moses was sitting in a tent and the Lord was standing there dictating to him early Genesis, and Moses was writing it down into a Torah, then God is the narrator of that story. And if God is the narrator of that story, then chapter 7 and parts of chapter 8 are pointing to a global flood. However, that's not what the text says. That is twisting the text into something it isn't. The text does not say that God is the narrator. It does not say that God dictated early Genesis to Moses. It does not say that, in fact, it says the opposite. It has God as a character in the account and the narrator is someone else. It's the opposite of that. Just read it. Even using the plain reading, you can tell God isn't the narrator of this account. Who is then? If the tablet theory is correct, and the tablet theory has been ignored by scholars for some time, and that, in my opinion, is a mark in its favor, because with their premises, they're getting almost everything wrong. They're blind guides leading the blind. Please do not listen to them. They are, despite their knowledge of facts, when it comes to understanding, they are some of the most ignorant people you could possibly listen to. Don't do it. Their premises won't even allow them to understand what the text is saying. It's not that they happen to be wrong a lot. It's that they've adopted premises that do not allow them to get it. So, they're out. But the text, if Moses had tablets from his ancestors, if he wasn't starting from a blank slate, and he edited them into early Genesis, the first 36, 37 chapters of Genesis were him taking his family records and writing them out, then the narrators can be the near descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This would be the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, and their near descendants told their story. And that was the way it was done in the ancient Near East. And that's what the tablet theory says. I didn't invent it. It's been around for a long time, but it's just been ignored, unfairly ignored. So, my position is early Genesis is from the tablet theory, and therefore the narrators are the near descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth telling their story. And because of that, they are truthfully saying what they saw. And if it's them talking, when it says, and the entire Eretz was covered, Eretz can be either translated earth or it can be translated land. If God is talking, it should be translated earth. He sees it all. All means all when God's talking. When I'm talking, I say all I see is water, that's not global. That's the land. That's the area I'm in. All means all I can see. Who's talking matters. So we have to understand what Genesis is as literature. And again, when you do this, it has apologetics value, because the naysayers say, oh, the Jews came along later and they stole it. They lifted these stories from the Babylonians much later and then adapted them to their needs. But the stories were around long before then. They were around even before the alleged time of Moses. Therefore, we know that this is not the original story. That nonsense goes away if the tablet theory is true, because Moses was compiling early Genesis from documents that were ancient even in his day. If I put together an anthology on some Greek war, it doesn't mean the Greek wars happened in my day. It means I'm putting together a string of earlier accounts from history, and that is what Moses was doing. Now that brings me to today. You can watch each of those videos if you care to, but that's a summary of the 3 previous videos. One on chapter 6 and a local flood, one on Peter and a local flood, one on chapter 7 and the flood account itself and a local flood. But now I want to talk about chapter 9. Chapter 9, verses 10 and 11 have often been used to indicate that people say, well, this must mean the flood was global. Let's look at what it really says. This is Genesis 9:11. This is an interlinear translation. I got it from BibleHub.com. So it has the English there at the bottom, at the very bottom in small letters. It has the Hebrew parts of speech. It's got the English translation of each part. It's got the Hebrew, it's got an English way to pronounce the Hebrew words, and then it's got the Strong's Concordance number, so we can go look up the definition of those words. Now, here's what they've got. It says, "Thus I establish my covenant with you, and never shall be cut off all flesh again by the waters of the flood, and never shall there be again a flood to destroy the earth." And they say, well, Mark, that is very cut and dried there. That's a global flood, because he's cutting off all flesh by the flood, and he's going to destroy the earth. And I'm going to go to some of the same points I made in the last video. They haven't picked good English words here. They're not using them. They're picking a word that has a range of meaning. They're taking one extreme in, and they're not taking it the way it's used elsewhere, and they're not taking it a way that they can easily look at it, that really the rest of the text is so consistent and points that way, that has another way to be translated, in a better way. So when it says, "Thus I establish," and establish means set up. I set up my covenant with you. And his covenant is that he's never again going to destroy the earth with a flood. And so they said, well, that means a global flood. Let's look a little deeper at what these words mean. We'll start with shall be cut off. Yek ka yet. And that is the Strong's word 3772. Let's take a look. Now, that word can mean destroy. The root word in that bunch can mean to be destroyed, is to be drowned in a flood or blotted out. But I want you to look at how this exact form of the word is used in Scripture. And I haven't got every example here, but the examples I got end with saying, "Hey, you shall not lack a man," at the bottom of this list. If you keep going in the BibleHub.com, which is where I got this, that's the translation that's on there very commonly. The next 4 or 5 translations, they say, "You shall not lack a man," and that's what it means. To be cut off means you shall not lack a man. Let's look at how the way they translate it in Genesis 9:11. When in your Bible it probably says destroy. That's never how it's used. This particular form of the word, it's never how it's used. In 9:11 here it says shall be cut off. Okay, in what sense shall be cut off? Does that mean they drown? Does that mean they die? Well, look at it in Leviticus 17. It is referring to being kicked out of the camp. You're going to be cut off from the camp. In Numbers 11, it refers to physically biting off a piece of meat to chew. You have a quail here, and you bite it, and you've cut off that piece. So it's very literally just to be cut off. Is the quail destroyed yet? He's not any deader than he was. The piece of meat is in their mouth. It hasn't been digested yet. In fact, one of the uses for this word is combined with the word destroy. You'll be cut off and destroyed, showing that it's really, this phrase is not used as a synonym of destroy. It can be related to it because you're being cut off from the camp and your fate is not good, but that's not you getting obliterated. And then, same thing in Joshua. Same thing in Ruth. Being cut off from your brothers. It doesn't necessarily mean you're dead. And then 2 Samuel. And really, when you get into 1 Kings, it says, "You shall not lack a man." So that phrase means you shall not lack a man. What is God saying here? Is he saying, never again will I kill everybody with a flood? No. He's saying, I'm giving you my promise. It's all about preserving the line of Messiah. That's what this account is about. When God's saying, never again am I going to send this flood and cut off the world from Messiah. If Noah hadn't obeyed, then the world would have been cut off from Messiah. If Noah had just believed God and blown him off and stayed there and not built the ark, then the world would never be saved. The line of Messiah and the chapter 2 works would all be wiped out. We would never have heard of Noah. We'd have never heard of Jesus. And the world would be a very miserable place. And it is already there's a lot of pain in this world, and it comes because men want to be God themselves, and they rebel against God. They're still doing it. But we have a way to salvation now. We have a way to God through Jesus Christ. And it's hardly even preached anymore, even in apologetics ministries, that they want to say the Bible is true, but they're saying, what is the Bible pointing to? It's pointing to this. It's pointing to salvation in our King, in our Lord, in our God. And that's what it's really about. And somehow that message has been lost in all this. I encourage you to go to Bible Hub and look yourself. This version of this word, this form of this word, just does not mean getting blotted out in a flood. It means to be cut off. And that's exactly what I am saying the flood would do in this local flood with global consequences. It would cut off mankind from God. It would cut off mankind from the camp. It would cut off mankind from salvation. Because the line of Messiah and the chapter 2 works meant to prepare the world for Messiah, to bring us to a point of civilization where we could receive it. They would have been blotted out. And that's what this word literally says. And it's uplifting to Jesus. And I don't know why Christians would want to they should receive it with joy. Instead, some seem to be resisting it. It's terrible. It's like, why resist so hard against understanding this verse for the first time in a way that uplifts Christ? Because you have to admit you didn't know everything before? Is that the problem? That's pride. That's pride. That's the sin of the devil. Don't do that. This is a Christ-centered way to look at early Genesis, and it's glorious. But let's go on in this verse. Okay, but later in the verse, it says he's going to destroy the earth. What's up with that? Well, this term, it's amazing how consistent in this account from chapter 6 all the way through chapter 9. How when Elohim is speaking, when he's describing what's going to happen to the earth, he uses this word. When Yahuwah is speaking, when Yahweh is speaking, and he says, I'm going to blot out what I have made, not what we have made, not in chapter 1 where it says, let us make man in our own image, but in chapter 2 where Yahweh Elohim, he makes things. He says, when I blot out he uses a different word, and that word does mean to blot out or destroy, as you would do in a flood. But that's not the world. That's chapter 2. That's Adam, and that's a smaller set of animals, and I show that in the earlier videos that he has made. But when Elohim speaks, he uses this word, shakhath, which means, can it mean destroy? Yes, but not in the same way. It means corrupt, ruin, spoil, decay, or one way they put it is to perhaps go to ruin is what it says is a definition. And it's there. It says perhaps to go to ruin. And if we look at how this word is used, it was used in chapter 6 to say what was happening to the earth. Because the earth was corrupt, I'm going to corrupt them with the earth. I'm going to ruin them with it. They want corruption, I'll give it to them. And it is perfectly consistent with what? Cutting off the line of Messiah. But it's not the word you use. It's not the word that Yahweh used to describe blotting them out as if they were drowning in a flood. It means they are separated from their source of life. You pluck a pear, and the biological functions inside that pear may continue for a time, but guess what? It's dead. Even as it continues these biological functions, it's being separated from its source of life. And this world, if the line of Messiah and if those chapter 2 works had been blotted out, they would be separated from their source of life. They may continue for a time as they wind down and rot, but things would just get worse and worse. Nothing would get better and better. And that is the fate that God says, I will never do that again. Never again will you lack a man. A man to do what? A man to carry forth this plan to redeem the world through Messiah. And if Noah hadn't obeyed, that's what it would have come to. And God says, I'm not going to leave it to Noah anymore, or any man. I'm going to preserve this plan to bring Messiah. It doesn't matter how rotten and stinking you humans are, and we are plenty rotten and stinking. But he is going to be faithful. He is going to keep the line of Messiah. Praise the name of God. It is really a glorious truth. I don't know why anyone who claims the name of Christ would want to resist it or do anything other than embrace it joyfully as I have. But I do thank you so much for listening, and may God bless you.